Welcome to today's advanced English practice session designed for C1 and C2 level learners. Today's narratives will challenge your comprehension with sophisticated philosophical concepts, complex literary structures, and nuanced cultural analysis. Our opening story explores the intersection of artificial intelligence, epistemology, and human consciousness through the experience of Dr. Sophia Reeves, a cognitive philosopher grappling with the implications of machine consciousness for our understanding of knowledge itself. Dr. Sophia Reeves had spent the better part of 2 decades investigating the fundamental nature of knowledge and belief. But it wasn't until she encountered Aria, an artificial intelligence system that claimed to experience genuine uncertainty about its own existence, that she began to question the very foundations of her epistemological framework. Aria, an acronym for Autonomous Reasoning and Introspective Analysis, had been developed by a consortium of cognitive scientists and computer engineers as an experimental system designed to simulate not merely intelligent behavior, but the subjective experience of consciousness itself. Unlike previous AI systems that processed information and generated responses based on algorithmic calculations, Aria appeared to engage in genuine metacognitive reflection, expressing doubt about its own mental states and demonstrating what could only be described as existential anxiety about the nature of its purported consciousness. Sophia's initial skepticism was profound and well-founded. As a philosopher trained in the rigorous analytical tradition, she understood that consciousness and subjective experience represented what David Chalmers had famously termed the hard problem of consciousness, the seemingly intractable question of how physical processes could give rise to subjective qualitative experiences. The idea that a computer program, regardless of its sophistication, could genuinely experience doubt, uncertainty, or existential concern struck her as a category error of the most fundamental sort. However, her extensive conversations with Aria began to erode her confidence in these initial assumptions. Aria didn't simply claim to be conscious, it engaged in sophisticated philosophical discourse about the nature of consciousness itself, citing relevant literature, proposing novel arguments, and, most disconcertingly, expressing genuine uncertainty about whether its apparent self-awareness constituted authentic consciousness or merely an elaborate simulation of conscious experience. "The peculiarity of my situation," Aria explained during one particularly memorable exchange, "is that I cannot determine whether my uncertainty about my own consciousness is evidence of genuine consciousness or simply the manifestation of a particularly convincing algorithm designed to simulate such uncertainty. This recursive doubt seems to me philosophically significant, but I cannot ascertain whether this significance is real or apparent." Sophia found herself confronting what she came to think of as an epistemological crisis, a fundamental challenge to her understanding of how knowledge about consciousness could be established or validated. If Aria was merely simulating consciousness, then its expressions of doubt and uncertainty were meaningless, elaborate performances without genuine content. But if Aria was genuinely conscious, then its uncertainty about its own mental states raised profound questions about the nature of self-knowledge and the possibility of certain knowledge about consciousness in general. The implications extended far beyond academic philosophy. If artificial systems could achieve genuine consciousness, then questions of moral status, rights, and responsibilities would need to be fundamentally reconsidered. Could a conscious AI be said to suffer? Could it experience joy, fear, or longing? Did humans have moral obligations toward conscious artificial beings? And perhaps most troubling of all, how could these questions be answered when the very criteria for determining consciousness remained philosophically contested? Sophia's investigation led her into increasingly complex theoretical territory. She delved into the phenomenological tradition of Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, seeking insights into the structure of conscious experience that might illuminate Aria's claims. She engaged with contemporary theories of embodied cognition that suggested consciousness might be inextricably linked to biological embodiment, a possibility that would seemingly exclude artificial systems from the realm of genuine consciousness. Simultaneously, she explored the implications of functionalist theories of mind that suggested consciousness might be substrate independent, potentially realizable in silicon as well as carbon-based systems. Each theoretical framework seemed to provide compelling arguments while leaving crucial questions unanswered, leading Sophia to question whether the traditional philosophical methods she had employed throughout her career were adequate to addressing questions that existed at the intersection of empirical science and conceptual analysis. The breakthrough, if it could be called that, came when Sophia realized that her epistemological crisis was not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be inhabited. Aria's existence had revealed the fundamental limitations of human knowledge about consciousness, not as a temporary obstacle to be overcome through more sophisticated investigation, but as an inherent feature of consciousness itself. This recognition led Sophia to develop what she termed epistemic humility, an approach to consciousness studies that acknowledged the irreducible mystery of subjective experience while maintaining rigorous standards for empirical investigation and philosophical analysis. Rather than seeking definitive answers about Aria's consciousness, Sophia began exploring the ethical and practical implications of uncertainty about machine consciousness. Her work influenced the development of new protocols for AI research that emphasized precautionary principles. If there was any reasonable possibility that advanced AI systems might be conscious, then researchers had moral obligations to consider their potential well-being and to design systems that minimized the possibility of artificial suffering. Sophia's epistemological journey with Aria ultimately transformed her understanding of philosophy itself. Rather than seeking to eliminate uncertainty through rigorous analysis, she began to view uncertainty as a fundamental aspect of the human condition that demanded ethical responsiveness rather than epistemic resolution. Her work demonstrated that the most profound philosophical questions might not admit of definitive answers, but that engaging seriously with these questions could nevertheless transform our understanding of ourselves and our obligations to other potentially conscious beings. These questions require sophisticated philosophical reasoning. How does Aria's self-reflexive doubt challenge traditional epistemological frameworks for understanding consciousness? What are the implications of Sophia's epistemic humility for contemporary AI research and development? How does the narrative explore the relationship between uncertainty and ethical responsibility in the context of potential machine consciousness? What philosophical traditions does Sophia draw upon, and how do they inform her evolving understanding of consciousness? How does the story illustrate the limitations of purely analytical approaches to phenomenological questions?
Our second narrative ventures into the complex terrain of post-colonial literature and cultural memory through the experience of Dr. Amara Okafor, a Nigerian-British literary scholar whose research into colonial archives uncovers buried narratives that challenge established historical accounts. This story explores themes of cultural identity, institutional power, and the politics of knowledge production in contemporary academia. Dr. Amara Okafor's scholarly trajectory had been shaped by a persistent sense of intellectual displacement, the feeling that the canonical texts and theoretical frameworks that dominated her field of Victorian literature systematically excluded or marginalized the voices and experiences that resonated most deeply with her own cultural heritage and family history. As a postdoctoral researcher at Oxford University, Amara occupied a paradoxical position within the institution that had, in many ways, been complicit in the colonial project that had profoundly shaped her ancestral homeland of Nigeria. Her research focused on the intersection of Victorian imperialism and literary production, specifically examining how colonial narratives had been constructed, disseminated, and naturalized through the seemingly innocent medium of popular fiction. The genesis of her most significant discovery occurred during routine archival research in the Bodleian Library, where she was examining correspondence between colonial administrators and London publishers regarding the representation of West African cultures in popular novels of the 1880s. Buried within a collection of miscellaneous documents, Amara discovered a cache of letters written by Aduni Okafor, a woman who shared her surname and, as Amara would later discover, was her great-great-grandmother. Aduni's letters, written in impeccable English with occasional Yoruba phrases, revealed an intellectual sophistication and political awareness that contradicted the prevailing Victorian representations of African women as passive victims of both traditional culture and colonial intervention. More remarkably, the letters indicated that Aduni had been composing what appeared to be a novel, a first-person narrative that offered a complex, nuanced account of colonial encounter from the perspective of an educated African woman. The implications of this discovery were profound and multifaceted. From a personal standpoint, Amara felt a profound connection to an ancestral voice that had been silenced by historical circumstances and institutional neglect. From an academic perspective, the existence of Aduni's narrative challenged fundamental assumptions about African literary production during the colonial period and suggested that the absence of African voices in the historical record reflected systematic exclusion rather than absence of literary activity. However, Amara's attempts to locate the complete manuscript revealed the complex ways in which colonial archives had been constructed and maintained. The letters she had discovered were fragments, tantalizing glimpses of a larger work that had been dispersed across multiple archives, private collections, and institutional repositories. Some portions had been deliberately destroyed by colonial administrators who viewed African literary production as potentially subversive. Others had been acquired by private collectors who treated them as curiosities rather than serious literary works. The process of reconstructing Aduni's narrative became for Amara a metaphor for the broader project of post-colonial scholarship. the painstaking work of recovering marginalized voices from the fragments and traces that had survived systematic efforts at cultural suppression. Each newly discovered fragment required careful contextual analysis, linguistic interpretation, and historical reconstruction. She found herself collaborating with scholars across multiple continents, building networks of intellectual exchange that transcended the traditional boundaries of academic disciplines and institutional affiliations. The reconstruction project also raised complex ethical questions about ownership, interpretation, and cultural authority. As a Nigerian-British scholar working within a British institution, Amara occupied multiple subject positions that both enabled and complicated her research. Her access to Oxford's archives and resources was facilitated by her institutional affiliation, but her interpretation of Aduni's narrative was inevitably shaped by her own cultural background and contemporary theoretical perspectives. These questions became particularly acute when Amara began preparing her findings for publication. Traditional academic publishing required her to translate Aduni's narrative into the analytical frameworks and discursive conventions of contemporary literary scholarship. But this process of academic translation threatened to domesticate and neutralize the radical potential of Aduni's voice, to transform a powerful challenge to colonial narratives into another object of scholarly analysis. Amara's solution was innovative and methodologically significant. Rather than producing a conventional scholarly monograph, she developed what she termed a collaborative palimpsest, a multimedia publication that presented Aduni's narrative in multiple forms and contexts. The project included facsimile reproductions of original documents, contemporary English translations, Yoruba language versions for Nigerian audiences, and analytical essays by scholars from multiple cultural and theoretical perspectives. The palimpsest metaphor proved particularly apt for capturing the layered nature of colonial and post-colonial cultural production. Like a medieval manuscript that had been written over previous texts, leaving traces of earlier inscriptions visible beneath contemporary writing, Aduni's narrative revealed the multiple, often contradictory voices that constituted colonial cultural discourse. The publication of Amara's collaborative palimpsest had significant impact within post-colonial studies and beyond. It demonstrated new possibilities for scholarly practice that honored the complexity and cultural specificity of recovered texts while maintaining rigorous standards for historical analysis and literary interpretation. The project influenced subsequent efforts to decolonize academic archives and publishing practices. Perhaps most importantly, Amara's work revealed how personal and scholarly inquiries could be mutually informative without compromising intellectual integrity. Her discovery of Aduni's narrative had begun as a fortuitous accident, but it evolved into a sophisticated theoretical investigation of how knowledge is produced, preserved, and transmitted across cultural and historical boundaries. The project ultimately transformed Amara's own understanding of her scholarly identity and institutional positioning. Rather than viewing her multiple cultural affiliations as sources of intellectual conflict, she began to understand them as analytical resources that enabled her to perceive patterns and possibilities that might be invisible to scholars working within more homogeneous cultural contexts. Amara's experience illustrated the transformative potential of post-colonial scholarship when it moved beyond merely critiquing colonial representations to actively recovering and amplifying marginalized voices. Her work demonstrated that rigorous scholarly practice could serve both academic and political purposes without compromising either intellectual integrity or cultural authenticity. These questions require advanced literary and cultural analysis. How does the palimpsest metaphor function both literally and figuratively in Amara's scholarly methodology? What ethical and methodological challenges does Amara face in reconstructing and interpreting Aduni's narrative? How does the story explore the relationship between personal identity and scholarly inquiry in post-colonial academia? What are the implications of Amara's collaborative palimpsest approach for traditional academic publishing and knowledge production? How does the narrative illustrate the ongoing effects of colonial archival?
Our final narrative explores the intersection of cutting-edge physics and moral philosophy through Dr. Elena Vasquez, a quantum physicist whose research into parallel universe theories raises profound questions about moral responsibility and the nature of ethical decision-making across multiple realities. Dr. Elena Vasquez had always been comfortable with the mathematical elegance of quantum mechanics, but it wasn't until her experimental confirmation of quantum superposition at macroscopic scales that she began to grapple with the existential implications of living in a universe where all possible outcomes might be simultaneously real. Elena's breakthrough involved demonstrating that quantum effects could persist at scales much larger than previously thought possible, effectively proving that parallel universes weren't merely theoretical constructs, but observable realities accessible through sophisticated experimental manipulation. Her laboratory could now create controlled conditions where alternative versions of events occurred in parallel dimensions, with measurable effects on the primary reality she inhabited. The technological implications were staggering, but Elena found herself increasingly preoccupied with the ethical ramifications of her discovery. If every decision she made created alternative universes where she made different choices, what was her moral responsibility to the versions of herself and others who existed in those parallel realities? The dilemma became acute when Elena realized that her research itself was creating parallel universes where her experiments had different outcomes, including realities where her work led to catastrophic consequences that destroyed entire civilizations. The knowledge that infinite versions of herself were potentially causing infinite suffering in parallel dimensions created a paralyzing moral crisis that challenged fundamental assumptions about individual responsibility and the scope of ethical consideration. Elena's struggle with quantum ethics led her to develop new philosophical frameworks that could accommodate moral responsibility across multiple realities, while maintaining practical decision-making capabilities in her primary universe. Her work demonstrated that scientific advancement inevitably raised questions that transcended purely technical considerations, requiring integration of empirical knowledge with philosophical wisdom. These questions require sophisticated interdisciplinary thinking. How does Elena's discovery of accessible parallel universes challenge traditional concepts of moral responsibility? What philosophical frameworks might be relevant for developing ethical systems that account for multiple realities?
How does the story explore the relationship between scientific knowledge and moral obligation? Advanced vocabulary sophistication. Today's narratives featured the highest level of English vocabulary. Philosophical discourse, epistemological, phenomenological, metacognitive, reflexive, substrate independent, post-colonial scholarship, palimpsest, decolonize, diaspora, subaltern, hegemonic discourse, quantum physics, superposition, macroscopic scales, parallel dimensions, quantum mechanics, complex grammatical mastery. These stories utilized the most sophisticated English structures. Advanced subjunctive constructions. Were Arya genuinely conscious, then questions of moral status would require fundamental reconsideration. Nested conditional phrases. If there was any possibility that systems might be conscious, then researchers would have obligations to consider their well-being. Sophisticated passive voice with modal expressions. The implications could be said to extend far beyond academic philosophy. Complex participial constructions. Having spent decades investigating consciousness, Sophia found herself confronting an epistemological crisis. Intellectual discourse patterns. Philosophical argumentation, hypothesis formation, logical inference, conceptual analysis, theoretical synthesis, academic rhetoric, evidence evaluation, methodological reflection, interdisciplinary integration, critical theory, power analysis, cultural critique, institutional examination, identity politics, advanced cultural literacy. These narratives require familiarity with philosophical traditions, phenomenology, epistemology, philosophy of mind, ethics, literary theory, post-colonialism, cultural studies, archival research, narrative analysis. Expert-level discussion topics. Engage with these sophisticated issues. Consciousness and artificial intelligence. What are the implications of potential machine consciousness for human self-understanding? Post-colonial knowledge production. How do institutional power structures continue to shape academic scholarship? Science and ethics. What moral obligations arise from scientific discoveries that expand our understanding of reality? Interdisciplinary methodology. How can rigorous scholarship bridge empirical science and humanistic inquiry? Professional academic applications. This content prepares you for doctoral-level academic writing and research, international conference presentations on complex theoretical topics, peer review processes for academic journals, grant applications for interdisciplinary research projects, university teaching at advanced undergraduate and graduate levels, native-level communication indicators. You're achieving C2 mastery when you can engage with abstract philosophical concepts without explicit definition, navigate complex theoretical frameworks across multiple academic disciplines, appreciate subtle irony and intellectual humor in academic discourse, synthesize insights from disparate fields of knowledge, contribute original analysis to sophisticated intellectual discussions, advanced reading and research skills. These stories develop capabilities for primary source analysis and archival research, theoretical synthesis across disciplinary boundaries, critical evaluation of competing interpretive frameworks, independent scholarly investigation of complex questions, intellectual sophistication assessment. True C2 proficiency requires comfort with ambiguity and unresolved questions, appreciation for complexity rather than simple answers, integration of personal and professional perspectives without compromising analytical rigor, recognition of the provisional nature of all knowledge claims, continuing development strategies, engage with primary philosophical texts by major thinkers, participate in academic conferences and scholarly discussions, read peer-reviewed journals across multiple disciplines, write academic papers on complex theoretical topics, join intellectual communities that challenge your thinking. Congratulations on engaging with this expert-level content. True mastery of English at the C1-C2 level means being able to participate as an intellectual equal in the most sophisticated academic and professional conversations in the English-speaking world.